Well, really pleased to be joined with Craig Douglas, co-founder of the World Fund. Craig, tell me about the World Fund.
The World Fund is a 350 million climate tech venture fund, and we only invest in companies that have the potential to save at least 100 megatons of CO2 per year. So that's a significant number, but the reason we chose that is we think that both climate returns and impact returns can go hand in hand.
And help us put that 100 megaton figure into context. What does that look like?
So 100 megatons today would be, annually today, would be the equivalent of covering every residential home in the UK with solar panels. So about 20 million residential solar installations would be 100 megatons.
Wow, okay. So what sustainability innovation are you sort of most excited about that you think has the most potential?
Well, interestingly, I have two different answers to this. One is really technical focused, and one is what's the quickest and easiest way to create decarbonization. There is basically linking agriculture to the carbon markets. So agriculture responsible for a huge quantity of CO2, about a third of the world's emissions come from agriculture related, and yet that entire industry can become carbon negative. So if you ask me which is the most interesting in terms of decarbonization, single market, I would say, linking agriculture to carbon. In terms of a technical side of things, it's all about electrification. How can you move everything that's currently in fossil fuels into electric fuels? Or not electric fuels, but using electricity rather than fossil fuel related energy.
What do you see as the biggest challenge in building a more sustainable future?
I mean, the biggest issue is how do you do this at scale in a way that isn't going to add costs? And we're already seeing this in, for example, the energy industry, where already the lowest levelized cost of energy is in renewable energy, right? It's not fossil fuels anymore. The question is, can you do that across the board? Can you do that for heat generation? Can you do that for mobility? Can you do that for agriculture? All of these different ones. It's how can you do all of that at scale without everybody being worse off.
Yeah. So if you had 100 billion US dollars, what would you spend it on to advance our global progress and why?
I would be investing it in the technologies that have the largest potential to scale. So, and not the ones that are already at scale. So for example, solar, we're already at scale, the costs are already down. Where could that money be spent to decarbonize areas that aren't currently decarbonized? Okay, those are the ones that I'd be most interested in. So alternative proteins. So how do you scale up microprotein or fermentation-based protein? Not lab-grown meat. That's personal choice. But so that area in particular, potentially huge economies of scale, and industrial heat as well, huge economies of scale. But any technology where you can see the S-curve with volume, meaning that you can mass adopt it. That's where I think you can really have the biggest leverage.
Excellent. If you could implement a policy that would help us achieve global sustainability and climate goals, what would that policy be and why?
I mean,
big questions we're asking.
Well, big question, but actually it's a really simple answer. Create a realistic carbon price. Point blank.
Yeah.
And the market will decide what the most effective way is of implementing that. You put 100 euros a ton price of carbon, and we'll make our sustainability goals. Because there are already technologies out there that make sense at that price or less, and the market then determines which one is the most cost-effective way of doing it.
And the EU isn't doing that? What's holding it back?
Well, the question is, can you do it across the board? So one of the reasons why I say electrification, for example, is the electricity market is a regulated market where carbon is priced. So the best way of decarbonizing industries is to push them from non-regulated into a regulated market where carbon is priced effectively. The issue is if you want to price carbon in every market, that's a very difficult thing to do, particularly in markets that aren't already used to carbon prices. So if you suddenly have a carbon price associated with all the food that you eat, is a litre of milk going to double in price? Is your steak going to triple in price? How willing are people going to be to accept those sort of changes in those sort of markets, much more of a challenge.
Yeah, especially in a time of inflation, already existing inflation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting. What are some of the key outcomes you would like to see come out of COP28 this year?
Consistency across multiple geographies. So we see this in Europe a lot, where different countries within Europe are all doing their own thing. But then when you look at the European context as a whole, it's very difficult to see how everything all aligns together. Expanding that to globally, you have exactly the same thing. So, for example, IRA is a good example of this. But
The Inflation Reduction Act.
Inflation Reduction Act, absolutely. Where you have a policy in the US that a lot of the stuff in there requires US content, but a lot of the initial markets are in Europe. So you're requiring US content, like Europe and the US is a good example where we're quite aligned in our interests. And yet there's the potential for us to be creating two parallel production capacities, two parallel lines, which ends up being a lot less efficient. Whereas I think if you can actually coordinate all of that properly, you can still keep your global supply chains whilst reducing risk, and that also means that you can do things in the most cost-effective way possible.
Yeah.
So some more focus on global alignment to allow things to translate so you can do the cheapest thing possible in one market and transfer it into another market.
How can the recent momentum on global action on biodiversity be sustained?
It's an interesting one. In terms of biodiversity, as much as possible where you can start linking it to something where people can see an economic benefit. So how do you actually make sure that you can maintain it, make sure that there's a seen economic benefit behind it as well. As soon as people start seeing an economic benefit behind it, then it'll be monitored more effectively, it'll be implemented more effectively, it'll be seen as a value creation. And as soon as you can actually, everyone can accept that it actually creates value, and I think those of us who are actually looking at it in detail, it definitely does. If you can make that a widespread understanding, and then people can actually value it properly.
Is this sort of nature as an asset class?
I would love to see that, right? And adopted in a much more broad context. At the moment, you're seeing it more in terms of things like mining grants. So if you want to do something in an area and you're mining it, then you actually have to, the biodiversity that you're destroying, those companies are required to increase biodiversity in areas without biodiverse situation. But how can you make that into something that is seen as an asset class in and of itself, rather than just being a compensation mechanism when you're doing something bad?
Yeah.
That's what I would love to see.
Interesting. Excellent. Craig, thank you so much for joining us. And hope you enjoy Sustainability Week.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.